before, before 100 years pass. So in 1911, a number of the Jesuit universities were starting law schools. And the reason was because the United States was growing. There's a very substantial immigrant population who could not go to law school. Jews, Catholics were not admitted to the Harvard and the Yales and the Berkeleys and these places and Stanfords that had schools. And so the Jesuits thought that it would be helpful for the communities to create opportunities for at that time men, and certainly the Jesuit university law schools were the first in the country to admit women back in the 50s and 60s, when it was years later before other schools did that. Persons of color were not admitted to law schools at all. And Santa Clara started that tradition, a significant part of who we are today in the 50s. And so it was a part of certainly the outreach to those new growing communities in the United States. And I found it very interesting about how that thinking that caused the creation of our law school and other Jesuit law schools in the early 1900s really is a part of our tradition today. And I'll mention a little bit about that. So in 1911, they had a very charismatic president who decided it was time that they had a department or an institute of law. There were three other law schools, and actually they were departments of schools at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Southern Cal, and at Hastings. So I can't count, there were four, and Santa Clara was the fifth that had started a department for the study of law. And it was all evening. They had lectures by downtown lawyers and judges who would come in and give a lecture on a subject. There were 12 men that started in 1911. Today, we have about 300 students start a year in our school. We selected last year's freshman class, first-year class, and it will be true of next year's class, from about 4,000 applications for those 300 spots. So these 12 men started in 1911. Their tuition, their annual tuition, was $400 a year, which included mending and laundry service that the university would provide to keep their clothes up to snuff and what have you. Our tuition is $42,000 a year, and we're maybe among California law schools, state and private. We're in maybe barely in the top third of the 20 California schools, California law schools. I could do a more comparative analysis, but I didn't. I have a little idea of what the local law schools charge, and they're not that far away from that. Today, Berkeley, Hastings, UCLA are all more expensive than Santa Clara because of the economic crisis in California, and of course that's true in a lot of states. There's essentially kind of a privatization action in many states where the state law schools are being cut off of the state subsidy, and so they have to finance their entire program through tuition. So in any event, there's it's a very competitive environment. It's very expensive to go to law school, but we award more than $5 million a year in scholarship assistance to our students. About $1 million of that comes from endowments and scholarship gifts from graduates and friends and that sort of thing. So in our last capital campaign, we added about 45 new endowed scholarships, and that's going to help us to recruit these very talented students. In 1911, there were 3 or 4 men from downtown who came out at night and they would give a lecture or teach a course. Today we have 60 full-time faculty. About 40% of that group teach exclusively in what you might call the skills area. They teach advocacy skills, they teach trial practice skills, they teach writing, oral advocacy skills. They work in our clinical programs. We have 2 clinics. We're adding 2 more clinics this coming year. It's an unfortunate term. They call them live client clinics. The idea is that you have real clients. You think about what's the alternative. Maybe it's an estate planning. The antithesis is an estate planning clinic. And we've got just a remarkable and talented group. We have some of the early faculty members who were hired by George Alexander in the 60s and 70s, Ken Manister and Cynthia Mertens and Ed Steinman. But then we also have a group. I've hired about 1/3 of the faculty since I came to the law school in 2003. So we have 2 Rhodes Scholars teaching at the school. We have a couple of former U.S. Supreme Court law clerks for Stevens and Sandra Day O'Connor who teach in our faculty. We've had faculty members who have